When the individuals were returned to these countries, their governments didn't prosecute them. What information did the United States share with Ecuador and Colombia about these individuals? Did you share that information or any evidence you have of crimes that they may have committed? And just to give this some context, the justification for the boat strikes is that we are killing drug dealers. And so if we have the United States government has determined that they're drug dealers, they should have evidence to provide to these countries that these are in fact drug dealers so that the countries can then go prosecute them. So what information did the State Department provide, or what information do you know of that was provided by any department of the United States government?
Thank you, Congressman. In this instance, it was the Department of War that conducted the strike and recovered the 2 survivors. They effected the return with the assistance of the State Department. We worked with the 2 host governments you referenced to facilitate their return.
I need a moment here because what we just witnessed was not merely political theater or campaign posturing, but something far more insidious, far more structurally violent, and infinitely more revealing about the authoritarian paternalism that animates contemporary conservative governance in this country. And before I even begin to unpack the layers of hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy on display, in this clip we need to acknowledge the sheer breathtaking audacity of Donald Trump standing there, literally signing an executive order on marijuana rescheduling, while simultaneously insisting with that characteristic mixture of rambling incoherence and moralizing condescension that this has nothing whatsoever to do with legalization, that it doesn't sanction recreational use in any way, shape, or form, that he's always told his children don't take drugs, no drinking, no smoking, just stay away, as if we haven't been paying attention, as if we can't see through this transparently cynical political calculation designed to capture young voters and independents without actually committing to the kind of transformative criminal justice reform that would meaningfully address the decades of devastation wrought by the war on drugs. And here's what's so maddening. What should make every single person watching this absolutely furious? Trump just signed an executive order directing marijuana to be federally rescheduled, moving it from Schedule 1, where it sits alongside heroin, to Schedule 3, completing a process initiated under the Biden administration that he's now claiming credit for. Yet he stands there comparing cannabis to dangerous prescription painkillers that can cause irreversible damage and wreck lives, deploying the same tired drug war rhetoric that has been thoroughly discredited by decades of research and lived experience, the same moralizing framework that has incarcerated millions of predominantly Black and brown Americans for possessing a substance that 64% of Americans, according to Gallup polling, believe should be legal, and we're supposed to celebrate this. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here, because the media narrative around this moment is already coalescing into something deeply inadequate, something that treats Trump's action as progress, when in fact it represents the bare minimum conceivable reform wrapped in layers of reactionary messaging designed to reassure his conservative base that he's not actually embracing the kind of comprehensive legalization and restorative justice framework that the moment demands. And you want to talk about cynicism. You want to understand what it looks like when a political figure calculates that they can have it both ways, that they can throw a bone to younger voters clamoring for cannabis reform, while simultaneously telling their children, and by extension all American children, that drugs are bad, and you should never touch them, never mind that nearly 7 in 10 Americans say that the use of marijuana should be legal, with 68% of respondents endorsing cannabis legalization, never mind that half of Americans have tried marijuana at some point, never mind that 69% of respondents, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, back legalization, were still subjected to this paternalistic lecture about staying away from illegal and unregulated drugs. And here's the bombshell that should infuriate every single progressive, every advocate for racial justice, every person who understands that the war on drugs has been one of the most catastrophic policy failures in American history. Trump's order does absolutely nothing for the millions of people currently sitting in prisons and jails or living with the permanent scarlet letter of a drug conviction on their records. Adrian Rocha from the Last Prisoner Project called it a major shift in federal policy, but called on Trump to couple it with clemency for people imprisoned for cannabis-related offenses. And this is where we need to pause and really sit with the magnitude of what's being left behind here, because rescheduling marijuana to Schedule 3 is not some radical transformation of drug policy. It's a technocratic adjustment that allows pharmaceutical companies to conduct more research and lets state-licensed cannabis businesses take tax deductions, but it does nothing to address the fundamental injustice at the heart of prohibition, the fact that Black Americans are arrested for violating marijuana possession laws at nearly 4 times the rates of white Americans. Despite comparable usage rates, the fact that in 2010 blacks were 3.3 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession compared to whites, despite a similar rate of cannabis use, and even in states that have moved toward decriminalization or legalization, racial disparity persists, and in some jurisdictions the racial arrest disparity for cannabis has even increased, which tells you everything you need to know about how deeply embedded anti-black racism is in every layer of our criminal legal system, not just in the laws themselves, but in enforcement patterns, prosecutorial discretion, sentencing guidelines, parole decisions, every single point of contact between marginalized communities, and a system designed from its inception to control and cage them. And while Trump stands there taking credit for completing Biden's rescheduling process, let's talk about what the Biden administration actually did, because the contrast is instructive. Biden expanded pardons for the offense of simple marijuana possession and use under federal law. And while those pardons had significant limitations, they didn't expunge records and they didn't apply to state convictions where the vast majority of marijuana prosecutions occur. At least Biden acknowledged that criminal records for marijuana use and possession have imposed needless barriers to employment, housing, and educational opportunities, and too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana. At least there was recognition that this represents a profound injustice that demands remedy, but Trump can't even bring himself to acknowledge that basic reality. He has to couch everything in this language of danger and harm, and telling his kids to stay away. And the reason this matters, the reason this isn't just stylistic difference but substantive moral failure, is that language shapes policy, which shapes lived reality for millions of people. And when you frame marijuana as something dangerous that responsible parents warn their children against, even as you're technically moving it to a lower schedule, you're reinforcing the stigma that makes comprehensive reform politically impossible. You're giving cover to prosecutors who want to keep charging people, to employers who want to keep discriminating, to housing authorities who want to keep denying applications. Let me hit you with another bombshell, because this gets even more grotesque when you understand the timeline here. The Biden administration ordered U.S. prosecutors to be extremely cautious about how to handle future cannabis cases, according to previously unpublished guidance, but that discretionary policy was explicitly rescinded under the Trump administration in September, meaning that while Trump was preparing to sign this rescheduling order for political gain, his own Department of Justice was simultaneously removing protections that discouraged marijuana prosecutions, prompting at least one federal prosecutor in Wyoming to direct law enforcement agencies to start rigorously prosecuting simple cannabis possession offenses occurring on federal land. So we have this Orwellian situation where Trump gets to pose as the guy bringing about marijuana reform while his administration is literally intensifying enforcement. And if that doesn't crystallize the bad faith at work here, if that doesn't demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt that this is purely about electoral calculation, rather than genuine commitment to ending the harms of prohibition, then I don't know what would convince you. Now let's address the elephant in the room, because Trump's personal moralizing about drugs needs to be interrogated with the rigor it deserves. Here's a man who has built his entire public persona around excess, around conspicuous consumption, around the pursuit of pleasure and status and domination, telling us that he's always instructed his children don't take drugs, no drinking, no smoking, and setting aside the rich irony of Trump presenting himself as a paragon of clean living, given everything we know about his lifestyle and his associations. What's really at work here is a class-inflected moralism that has always animated conservative approaches to drug policy, the idea that certain people, certain kinds of people, the respectable people, the people with money and social capital, can be trusted to make good choices and deserve protection from temptation, while other people, the poor, the racialized, the marginalized, need to be controlled and surveilled and imprisoned for their own good. And this paternalism runs through Trump's remarks like a live wire. You can hear it in how he compares marijuana to prescription painkillers that wreck lives if abused. Never mind that the opioid crisis was manufactured by pharmaceutical companies who understood exactly what they were doing when they flooded communities with OxyContin and Percocet. Never mind that the real irreversible damage has come not from cannabis, which has never caused a fatal overdose in human history, but from prohibition itself, from the violent enforcement regime, from the incarceration, from the generational trauma inflicted on families and communities. And here's another bombshell that should make your blood boil. Multiple top congressional Democrats made the case that rescheduling would not go far enough, including one senator who said the move is only an attempt by Trump to gaslight voters into thinking he legalized cannabis to boost his pathetic approval ratings. Which is exactly right. This is gaslighting in its purest form, creating the appearance of reform while preserving the essential architecture of prohibition and punishment. And the tragic irony is that millions of people who desperately need comprehensive cannabis policy reform, who need their records expunged, who need release from incarceration, who need access to economic opportunities in the legal cannabis industry, who need protection from ongoing criminalization, are going to see headlines about Trump rescheduling marijuana and think progress is being made when in reality, this changes almost nothing for them. The cops can still arrest them, the prosecutors can still charge them, the judges can still sentence them, employers can still refuse to hire them, landlords can still deny them housing, and all of this continues while Trump and his wealthy supporters in the cannabis industry, because let's not forget he held meetings with cannabis executives in the Oval Office. Before announcing this, reap the financial rewards of a quasi-legal market that remains inaccessible to the communities most harmed by prohibition. Now I want to zoom out for a moment, because this particular instance of cynical half-reform sits within a much broader context of how the conservative movement approaches questions of bodily autonomy and personal liberty, and the contradictions are so glaring they would be laughable if they weren't so deadly serious. These are the same people who scream about freedom and individual rights when it comes to vaccine mandates or mask requirements, who invoke the sacred principle of personal sovereignty when confronting any public health measure that might mildly inconvenience them, but suddenly when we're talking about what adults choose to put in their own bodies for recreation or medication or spiritual exploration, suddenly it's all about danger and harm, and the need for state intervention. Suddenly we need laws and enforcement and consequences, and you can draw a direct line from this contradiction to the deeper authoritarian impulses at the heart of contemporary conservatism, the belief that freedom is for me and mine, for people who look like me and think like me and worship like me, while everyone else needs to be controlled and disciplined and shown their place. And marijuana prohibition has always been about social control far more than public health. You can trace it back to Harry Anslinger and the explicitly racist origins of cannabis criminalization. The first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics declared there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. This is the foundation. This rot runs all the way down to the roots. And let me hit you with yet another bombshell, because the more you look at Trump's record on drugs, the more incoherent and opportunistic it becomes. Trump has spoken about his late brother who died from alcohol addiction, saying it was devastating, using that personal tragedy to position himself as someone who understands the dangers of substance use, but that understanding never translated into support for evidence-based harm reduction approaches, or treatment on demand, or any of the interventions that actually save lives. Instead, Trump has pushed for extreme measures such as the death penalty for those who sell drugs. He's embraced the most punitive possible responses, even as overdose deaths rose dramatically under his watch. When his administration criminalized all fentanyl-related substances in 2018, overdose deaths surged 60% in just 4 years, proving once again that criminalization doesn't solve drug problems, it exacerbates them, it drives use underground, it prevents people from seeking help, it cuts off access to testing and safe supply, and now in his second term, the Trump administration has slashed at least $345 million in federal funding that supports treatment, overdose prevention, and other health services. The changes, so even as he's signing this marijuana rescheduling order for the cameras, he's simultaneously defunding the programs that keep people alive, that help them recover, that address the actual public health dimensions of substance use. But here's what really gets me, what keeps me up at night thinking about the sheer magnitude of wasted potential and unnecessary suffering. We are living through a moment of unprecedented public support for marijuana legalization. We have 66% of voters, including 75% of Democrats, 67% of independents, and 54% of Republicans supporting legalizing marijuana at the federal level for all adults over the age of 21. We have decades of evidence from states that have legalized showing that the sky doesn't fall, that teen use doesn't spike, that public health outcomes actually improve in many cases. We have an emerging consensus among researchers and advocates, and even many law enforcement officials, that prohibition has failed catastrophically, and we need a completely different approach. And instead of seizing this moment to enact transformative change that would repair some of the harm caused by 50 years of drug war, instead of coupling rescheduling with mass clemency and expungement and reinvestment in affected communities and prioritizing social equity in the legal cannabis industry, instead of doing any of that, Trump gives us this pathetic half measure wrapped in moralizing rhetoric about telling kids to stay away from drugs. And the tragedy is that this will be celebrated in some quarters as progress, Moderate Democrats will probably praise it as bipartisan achievement. Cable news will run segments about Trump's evolution on cannabis, and all the while millions of people will continue to suffer the consequences of prohibition that remains fundamentally intact. And we need to talk about what rescheduling actually means in practical terms, because this is where the gap between perception and reality becomes a chasm. The two main benefits of moving marijuana to Schedule 3 are fewer regulatory barriers to medical research and a financial boon to state-licensed cannabis suppliers who will no longer be barred from deducting standard business expenses when they file their federal tax returns. That's it, that's what we're talking about here. Easier research, which is good but should have happened decades ago, and tax relief for businesses that are already operating in a quasi-legal gray zone. Rescheduling, even combined with clemency, does not lift the various legal disabilities associated with marijuana convictions, cannabis consumption, or participation in the cannabis industry. Those include loss of Second Amendment rights and ineligibility for admission, legal residence, and citizenship under immigration law. So if you're an immigrant who got caught with a joint 15 years ago, if you're someone who's been denied housing or employment because of a possession charge, if you're one of the thousands of people still incarcerated for cannabis offenses, Trump's order does exactly nothing for you. Your life remains constrained by the consequences of prohibition. Your opportunities remain foreclosed. Your freedom remains curtailed. Let me absolutely bombard you with the scale of injustice we're talking about, because numbers sometimes fail to capture human suffering, but they're necessary to grasp the magnitude. There were nearly 700,000 cannabis arrests in the United States in 2018 alone, which accounted for over 40% of all drug arrests and surpassed the total number of arrests for all violent crimes combined. Think about that for a second. We arrested more people for cannabis than for murder, assault, rape, and robbery combined. We devoted more police resources, more prosecutor time, more court hours, more jail cells to pursuing people for possessing a plant that the majority of Americans think should be legal, and those arrests fell overwhelmingly on Black and brown communities. Black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, notwithstanding comparable usage rates, and in 31 states racial disparities were actually larger in 2018 than they were in 2010. Meaning that even as public opinion shifted toward legalization, even as states began reforming their laws, the racialized enforcement of prohibition intensified, and in some places the disparities are almost incomprehensible. One county in Georgia was found to have Black people being 97.2 times more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana, not 2 times or 5 times but nearly 100 times more likely, and we're supposed to believe this is about public health or safety rather than maintaining racial hierarchy through selective enforcement of drug laws. And here's another bombshell about what real reform would look like, and why Trump's action falls so catastrophically short. When Biden issued his marijuana pardons, which themselves were limited and inadequate, he at least acknowledged that criminal records for marijuana use and possession have imposed needless barriers to employment, housing, and educational opportunities, that too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana, that it's time that we right these wrongs, that language matters, because it establishes a moral framework that recognizes prohibition as injustice rather than neutral policy. It creates political space for further reform. It signals to prosecutors and judges and employers that times are changing, but Trump can't even bring himself to say the words. He can't acknowledge that prohibition has been wrong, that it's caused massive harm, that we owe a debt to the people and communities we've devastated. Instead, we get this lecture about prescription painkillers and telling his kids not to do drugs, and the message is clear. Marijuana might move to Schedule 3 for technical reasons related to research and business taxation, but it's still bad, it's still dangerous, you still shouldn't use it, and by extension, the people who do use it are still making bad choices, and the people who've been arrested and incarcerated, well, maybe they should have made better decisions. This is what I mean about how language shapes reality, because Trump's framing here actively undermines the possibility of comprehensive reform. When you continue to stigmatize cannabis and cannabis users, even as you're technically moving it to a lower schedule, you're giving ammunition to every prosecutor who wants to keep filing charges, every employer who wants to keep discriminating, every school administrator who wants to keep expelling students, every housing authority that wants to keep denying applications. The formal legal change doesn't matter if the cultural and moral framework remains one of prohibition and punishment, and this is why movements for drug policy reform have always insisted that we need to not just change laws, but transform consciousness. We need to challenge the fundamental assumptions that undergird prohibition, the idea that drug use is inherently pathological, that it represents moral failure, that people who use drugs need to be controlled and reformed rather than met with compassion, and given agency over their own bodies and lives. And Trump's remarks here reveal that he has internalized none of this, that his calculation is purely political, throw young voters a bone with technical rescheduling, while reassuring the conservative base that you still think drugs are bad, and you told your kids not to use them. Now I want to spend a moment on the absolute hypocrisy of Trump's moralizing about substance use, because this matters. This isn't ad hominem attack, but necessary contextualization of who's speaking and what authority they're claiming. This is a man who has built a business empire partly on gambling and alcohol, whose properties include casinos and bars designed to separate people from their money while selling them addictive products, who spent decades in the New York social scene that was notorious for cocaine use, who has been credibly accused of using stimulants himself, who bragged about walking in on teenage beauty pageant contestants while they were changing, whose personal conduct by any metric suggests someone utterly unconcerned with traditional morality or self-restraint. And this person is standing there telling us he always told his children, don't do drugs, don't drink, don't smoke, and we're supposed to take this seriously, we're supposed to treat this as genuine concern rather than cynical performance. And the reason this matters beyond just pointing out hypocrisy is that it speaks to the class dynamics at work here. Trump's kids, the children of wealthy connected people generally, they can use drugs with relative impunity, they have access to treatment if things go wrong, they have lawyers if they get caught, they have second and third and fourth chances, while the kids from communities of color, from poor communities, from marginalized communities, they get arrested, they get prosecuted, they get incarcerated, their lives get derailed, and Trump's moralizing obscures those structural realities. It pretends that drug policy is about keeping children safe rather than maintaining social control. And let me hit you with what might be the most important bombshell of all, because this gets to the heart of what's at stake politically. 57% of American likely voters support legalizing marijuana in all 50 states, and a generational shift on cannabis is well underway, with a bipartisan majority rapidly emerging in favor of federal legalization. Younger voters will be highly sought after in this year's election, and they strongly support legalization, and 67% of likely voters 18 to 44 favor a nationwide legalization model compared to 57% of people 45 to 64. Supporters of Biden also strongly support reform at 68%. Which means there is massive political opportunity here for Democrats if they're willing to seize it, if they're willing to make a clear, unambiguous case for full legalization, coupled with restorative justice, for expungement and clemency and reinvestment, for treating this as the civil rights issue it fundamentally is. They could draw a stark contrast with Trump's cynical half measures. They could mobilize young voters and black voters and Latino voters and progressive voters who are desperate for leadership that takes this issue seriously. But instead we get this tepid response where Democrats kind of praise rescheduling while suggesting it doesn't go far enough, but not really making a big deal about it, and the opportunity slips away while people continue to suffer. Because here's the thing, here's what I need you to understand as we approach the end of this commentary. The war on drugs in general, and marijuana prohibition in particular, represents one of the most catastrophic policy failures in American history. It has incarcerated millions of people, predominantly people of color, for non-violent offenses. It has destroyed families and communities. It has diverted billions of dollars from education and healthcare and infrastructure into law enforcement and prisons. It has militarized police departments. It has corroded civil liberties. It has fueled mass incarceration, which itself constitutes a human rights crisis. And throughout all of this, throughout 50 years of escalating enforcement and rising incarceration, drug use rates have remained basically stable. We haven't made America drug-free. We've just made it more punitive and more racially stratified. And now when we finally have a moment where there's overwhelming public support for a different approach, where we could begin to repair some of that damage, we get Trump signing an executive order that technically moves marijuana to Schedule 3, while explicitly disclaiming any support for legalization and lecturing us about telling kids to stay away from drugs, and I'm supposed to not be enraged by this. I'm supposed to treat this as anything other than a profound moral failure and a wasted opportunity. The truth is that comprehensive marijuana legalization, coupled with restorative justice measures, represents the absolute bare minimum of what we owe to the communities that have borne the brunt of prohibition. We need to release everyone incarcerated for cannabis offenses immediately. We need to expunge all marijuana-related convictions from records. We need to create pathways for people with prior convictions to participate in the legal cannabis industry. We need to invest billions of dollars in the communities most harmed by the drug war. We need to ensure that the economic benefits of legalization don't just flow to wealthy, predominantly white entrepreneurs, but are shared with the people who suffered through prohibition, and none of that, Not one single element of that agenda is advanced by Trump's executive order. Instead, we get technical rescheduling that helps pharmaceutical companies and corporate cannabis businesses while doing nothing for the people still sitting in cages, still carrying the stigma of conviction, still denied opportunities because of marijuana charges on their records, and the fact that this will be celebrated in some quarters as progress. The fact that Trump will get credit for this from voters who aren't paying close attention is absolutely maddening because it allows the fundamental injustice of prohibition to continue while creating the illusion of reform. So as we watch Trump stand there in that clip, as we hear him insist that this order doesn't legalize marijuana in any way, shape, or form, that it doesn't sanction recreational use, that he's always told his kids to stay away from drugs, we need to recognize this for exactly what it is: cynical electoral politics dressed up as drug policy reform, a calculated attempt to appeal to younger voters without alienating the conservative base, a technical adjustment that benefits businesses while abandoning the millions of people whose lives have been destroyed by prohibition, and most fundamentally a moral failure, a refusal to acknowledge the injustice at the heart of the drug war, a continuation of the stigmatizing, moralizing framework that has always animated prohibition. And we cannot let this stand. We cannot allow this pathetic half-measure to be presented as adequate response to a crisis of mass incarceration and racial injustice. We need to demand full legalization. We need to demand restorative justice. We need to demand that our political leaders stop treating marijuana policy as a technical question about scheduling and start treating it as the profound civil rights issue it has always been. And until that happens, until we get leadership with the courage to dismantle prohibition entirely and repair the harm it's caused, we will continue to live in a country where millions of people suffer the consequences of laws that the majority of citizens think are unjust, where racial disparities in enforcement continue to tear apart communities, where the promise of liberty and justice for all remains cruelly unfulfilled, and that should outrage every single person who believes in freedom and equality and basic human dignity, which is why we cannot stop fighting, cannot stop organizing, cannot stop demanding the transformative change that this moment requires.